Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Netanyahu says any deal with Iran must include blowing up its nuclear facilities. So, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Tuesday that a U.S. diplomatic deal with Iran would work only if Tehran's civilian nuclear facilities are blown up under the supervision of the U.S., terms that would be a non-starter in negotiations with Tehran. So Netanyahu said in a video statement a day after meeting with President Trump, quote, "We agree that Iran will not have nuclear weapons. This can be done by agreement, but only if this agreement is Libyan style. They go in, blow up the installations, dismantle all of the equipment under American supervision and carried out by America. This would be good," end quote. So he's mentioning Libya, and he's referring to when Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, agreed to dismantle his nuclear program back in 2003 and allowed inspectors to verify his progress. But only 8 years later, in 2011, as you all know, Gaddafi was brutally killed by U.S.-backed militants after a NATO airstrike hit his convoy amid the U.S.-NATO bombing campaign, the U.S.-NATO intervention in Libya in 2011. So to invoke Libya, he knows what he's doing here. And it's interesting because back in the first Trump administration, someone else called for a Libya model when they were talking about North Korea, and that was John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor at the time, again, back in the first Trump administration. Nobody's more hawkish than John Bolton. He's almost a caricature of an American hawk. And Trump has previously criticized Bolton for bringing up Libya. He said in a tweet in 2020, again, this is Trump in 2020, "What would Bolton, one of the dumbest people in Washington, know? Wasn't he the person who so stupidly said on television the Libyan solution when describing what the U.S. was going to do for North Korea? I've got plenty of other Bolton stupid stories," end quote. So again, when you're trying to discuss this diplomacy, bringing up the Libyan solution when you're talking about nuclear programs, I mean, obviously Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program, but bringing it up, again, you know what you're doing. Gaddafi dismantled it in 2003, and just a short time later, he was killed in a U.S. intervention in his country. So President Trump has threatened to bomb Iran if a deal on its nuclear program is not reached, even though U.S. intelligence agencies have recently reaffirmed that there's no evidence Tehran is working toward a nuclear weapon. And in his video statement on Tuesday, Netanyahu brought up military action. He said that him and Trump discussed it at length. He said, quote, "The second possibility is that they drag out the talks, and then there is the military option. Everyone understands this. We spoke about this at length," end quote. So, of course, as we've been covering, the U.S. has undertaken a significant military buildup in the Middle East, which has included the deployment of B-2 bombers that could be used to strike Iran. And this buildup comes amid a heavy U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen, which the Trump administration is threatening to escalate. So amid all these tensions, the U.S. and Iran are set to hold high-level negotiations in Oman this Saturday. So I mentioned this yesterday, but Iran's foreign minister and Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, are going to be in Oman for these talks. Iran saying that they're going to be indirect talks. Trump saying they're going to be direct. Either way, the fact that you have Iran's foreign minister going to attend shows that they're taking this seriously. So according to Israel Hayom, Netanyahu and the rest of the Israeli delegation were unaware of the U.S. plans to start these negotiations before they visited the U.S. Apparently, Netanyahu was told about it right before they went out to speak to the press in the Oval Office. So the next one here gets into the diplomacy side of things. Iran's foreign minister says that Tehran is ready to work with the U.S. toward a deal. So Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said in an op-ed published by the Washington Post on Tuesday that Iran was ready to reach a deal with the U.S. on its nuclear program and said that the ball is now in America's court. So Araghchi and Steve Witkoff will hold negotiations in Oman this Saturday, as I mentioned. And again, the U.S. is saying they're direct. Iran's saying they'll be indirect. Araghchi said the recent engagement between the U.S. and Iran through letters and indirect messages has represented a, quote, genuine attempt to clarify positions and open a window toward diplomacy, end quote. So the Iranian foreign minister is saying that they believe this is a genuine attempt by the U.S. to open diplomacy, even with all the threats. And he's saying that the threats are sending, he gets into the military threats, but going into these talks, this is the message that Iran's putting out there. Araghchi said that Tehran was willing to reaffirm the pledge that it made when the 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA was signed, that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. Araghchi said, quote, 10 years after the JCPOA was concluded and nearly 7 years after the United States unilaterally walked away from it, there is no evidence that Iran has violated this commitment, end quote. And he pointed out that U.S. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard recently reaffirmed that there's no evidence Iran is building a nuclear weapon. He said that there may be concerns over Iran's nuclear program and that Tehran was willing to address them. He said, quote, we are willing to clarify our peaceful intent and take the necessary measures to allay any possible concern, end quote. Araghchi also said that Iran was ready to do business with U.S. companies. He said, quote, many in Washington portray Iran as a closed country from an economic point of view. The truth is that we are open to welcoming businesses from around the world. It is the U.S. administration and congressional impediments, not Iran, that have kept American enterprises away from the trillion-dollar opportunity that access to our economy represent, end quote. And I saw Trita Parsi, who's an Iran expert who I trust. He said, he pointed out that here the Iranian foreign minister is speaking Trump's language here, saying that there's a $1 trillion opportunity for American investment in Iran. Araghchi warned against the recent military threats from Trump and the U.S. military buildup in the Middle East, saying that it sends the signal that the U.S. is not really interested in diplomacy. He said, quote, mark my words, Iran prefers diplomacy, but it knows how to defend itself. We have never yielded to threats in the past, and we will neither do so now nor in the future. We seek peace, but will never accept submission, end quote. So while Iran is open to diplomacy with the U.S., Reuters reported that Tehran is skeptical of the U.S.'s intentions. One issue that Iran is concerned about is the fact that U.S. officials have called for a deal that would not only restrict Iran's nuclear program, but dismantle it altogether and limit its missile production and support for allies in the region. A senior Iranian official told Reuters, quote, Trump wants a new deal, end Iran's regional influence, dismantle its nuclear program, and halt its missile work. These are unacceptable to Tehran. Our nuclear program cannot be dismantled. Our defense is non-negotiable. How can Tehran disarm when Israel has nuclear warheads? Who protects us if Israel or others strike? End quote. And that's the thing. If Trump, based on what Steve Witkoff has said, in his recent interview with Tucker, it sounds like the nuclear thing is the big issue that they want to discuss, but we've seen all other, Mike Waltz has called for a complete dismantlement of their nuclear program, of their civilian nuclear program. I think Marco Rubio has said, they need a deal to limit ballistic missiles and their support for their allies in the region. And that was kind of Trump's whole thing when he pulled out of the JCPOA, is that he said, we need a better deal that covers their missiles. And they're just not going to go for that in any world. Iran's not going to disarm completely. It's just so we'll see what happens this Saturday if there's any progress made. I think this is probably the only chance. I think if Iran goes into this and finds that the U.S. is not really willing to give diplomacy a chance, or really willing to not make these types of demands, then I think this is like really the only shot. So hopefully some progress is made. It's tough to be hopeful about these things these days, but you never know. There's also the chance of Israel just trying to sabotage it with some sort of attack somewhere. They have a history of doing that. So we'll see what happens this Saturday. All right, so the next one here, U.S. airstrikes kill more civilians in Yemen. So dozens of U.S. airstrikes hit Yemen on Tuesday, a day after U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth threatened the U.S. would escalate its bombing campaign. According to the Anadolu agency, the Houthis reported that 22 U.S. airstrikes hit Yemen on Tuesday, including 11 in the northern Sadr province, 9 in the central Marib province, and 2 in the Red Sea province of Hodeidah. More U.S. strikes were reported in the provinces of Damar and Ib, so all over Houthi-controlled Yemen, which, as I like to point out, is where 80% of Yemenis live. Yemen's Sabah news agency reported that U.S. airstrikes in Hodeidah on Tuesday night hit residential areas, and according to the local authority in Hodeidah, 4 civilians were killed by the U.S. strikes and others were wounded. Women and children were among the casualties. You see this picture here. This is the aftermath of the strike. A man carrying what, not sure if the person he's carrying it, I believe I saw another picture and it's a girl that he's carrying. Not sure if she is alive or dead. I saw another picture of a girl who looked like she was probably dead. But these are images, photos released by the Yemeni news agency. Residential buildings have been a frequent target of U.S. strikes, as we've been covering, and this bombing campaign has taken a heavy toll on civilians. So this came after. So one thing that happened during the Netanyahu-Trump Oval Office meeting was that Trump got into Yemen a bit, and he turned things over to Pete Hegseth. And Hegseth vowed that the situation in Yemen would get worse for the Houthis. He said, quote, "It's been bad. It's been a bad 3 weeks for the Houthis, and it's about to get a lot worse," end quote. So Hegseth claimed that it had been a devastating campaign for the Houthis, despite reports that the airstrikes have only had limited success in destroying Houthi weapons and underground military infrastructure. During the meeting, President Trump also claimed the bombing campaign has been successful, but he acknowledged that the Houthis' missile program was highly sophisticated and that the weapons were made inside Yemen, which goes against the narrative that they're reliant on Iran for weapons. Trump said, quote, "We've really hit them hard, night after night, and we've gotten many of their leaders and their experts. They're experts on missiles. I mean, they actually make missiles. Nobody thought that, but they make missiles. It's highly sophisticated," end quote. And the thing is that I've known it for years that the Houthis make their own missiles and drones inside Yemen. This has been common knowledge for as long as I've been following the conflict in Yemen. Back in 2018 was when I really started following it very closely. And so, this makes it sound like that he started bombing Yemen without knowing that, which I think is possible because his people were probably telling him, oh, Iran gives them all their weapons. So Hegseth said that the bombing campaign would only get more unrelenting until the Houthis declare they will stop shooting at U.S. ships. And the thing is that they did stop. They stopped when there was a ceasefire in Gaza on January 19th. And they're saying, and they didn't actually start attacking U.S. ships again until after the U.S. started bombing them. And then they didn't start firing missiles at Israel until after that either. The U.S. started bombing them when they said they would reimpose the blockade on Israeli shipping. So they basically threatened Israeli shipping again in response to Israel imposing a full blockade on Gaza. And then the U.S. started bombing them because that's what this is about. This is to ensure Israel can continue its genocidal war. And the only thing that'll bring calm is if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. But it seems like they're ready to ramp up. There's reports that the U.S. might back some sort of ground assault. We'll see. All right, the next one here, the other side of Signalgate. So this is an article published in the New Yorker by Rosina Ali, and it is about basically the other side of Signalgate is the title, basically saying what we've been saying, that the real scandal with the Signalgate, obviously it's embarrassing that they added a journalist and to these war discussions, but the real scandal is bombing Yemen, an unauthorized war, bombing civilians, as was revealed by the full Signal chat that they celebrated bombing a residential building. And this article gets into one specific airstrike that happened at 1 a.m. in Yemen, that first night that they were bombing. And it gets into some details, basically saying that they destroyed this residential building, and everybody that was killed in there were women and children. And this was in northern Yemen in Sadr. And this is according to a person who lived, nearby who lost family in the airstrike. So it's worth reading. We have the archive version because the New Yorker has a paywall, but we put the archive version on the page if you want to go check it out. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks kill 58 in Gaza over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that U.S.-backed Israeli attacks killed at least 58 Palestinians and wounded 213 over the previous 24-hour period as Israeli strikes continued to pound targets across the besieged territory. The health ministry's numbers account for dead and wounded Palestinians brought to hospitals and morgues. They said there's still a number of victims under the rubble and on streets in areas where rescue crews cannot reach them. You see these three girls here. This is the aftermath of an Israeli strike that hit a home, but you see there's tents, in the area as well. So Israeli attacks included a strike on a home in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, which killed at least 11 Palestinians, including 5 children. Another strike on a separate home in Deir al-Balah killed 4 people. Another Israeli attack in the northern city of Beit Lahia flattened a home and killed a family of 7. There was also Israeli strikes in southern Gaza. The health ministry said that since March 18th, since they resumed the bombing campaign, at least 1,149 Palestinians have been killed. And a day earlier, this didn't include the people who were killed on Tuesday, but on Monday, the health ministry said that at least 505 children have been killed in that time in less than a month. And that's 36.3% of the deaths. And this is all supported, enabled, funded by the U.S. government. And besides the massive airstrikes and shelling, the Israeli military has expanded its ground offensive and now controls more than 50% of Gaza's territory. And Netanyahu is making clear the long-term plan is full military occupation and ethnic cleansing. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich says not even a grain of wheat will enter Gaza. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich declared that Tel Aviv would not lift its blockade of all goods entering Gaza. Since March, Israel has prevented all food, medicine, fuel, and other aid from reaching besieged Palestinians in the Strip. So speaking at a conference on Monday, Smotrich said, quote, not even a grain of wheat will enter Gaza, end quote. The leader of the religious Zionism party has emerged as one of the most outspoken Israeli ministers advocating for genocide in Gaza. He's about as bad as he can get. And on Tuesday, the UN Secretary General told reporters that the Israeli siege on Gaza has turned into a killing field. He said, quote, more than an entire month has passed without a drop of aid into Gaza. No food, no fuel, no medicine, no commercial supplies. As aid has dried up, the floodgates of horror have reopened. Gaza is a killing field, and civilians are in an endless death loop, end quote. Last year, Smotrich said that Israel would be justified if it starved all Palestinians in Gaza to death. This is his quote from last year. He said, quote, we are bringing in aid because there is no choice. We can't, in the current global reality, manage a war. Nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral until our hostages are returned, end quote. Smotrich has been very vocal in his support for Trump's plan for Gaza, for the ethnic cleansing, saying that it's underway, that it's happening, that they're going to carry it out. All right, so the next one here, Palestinian Americans outraged over the IDF killing teen. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and more on the 14-year-old Palestinian American Amir Mohammed Sada Rabi, who was killed by the IDF over the weekend. He's from New Jersey. So the Israeli military executed a Palestinian American teenager as he picked green almonds in a village in the occupied West Bank. Bereaved family and members of the Palestinian community in New Jersey told reporters on Tuesday. So they're saying they were picking green almonds when they were shot. The Israeli story is that they were throwing rocks at cars. Which one does the U.S. seem to be? When I asked for the statement from the State Department, the only thing that they mentioned to me was Israel, what Israel said. They didn't say anything about what the Palestinians are saying happened. So he was shot 11 times, according to these Palestinian Americans. He was shot 11 times. A 14-year-old kid. Even if 14 kids were throwing rocks, you don't just shoot them. It's just completely outrageous. But this is life under Israeli military occupation for the Palestinians. This just kind of gets into, we went over a lot of these details yesterday, but there's some more here. A doctor who examined the boy's body said that it appeared that Amir had been struck by 2 different types of bullets, including a type that exploded once it entered his body. And there were 2 gunshot wounds to the head. So they're known for, Israel's known to use these exploding bullets on Palestinians. So just absolutely really sad story here. Again, born in New Jersey, lived in this West Bank village where there's 80% of the residents are American citizens. A lot of Palestinian Americans spend their summers there, less so now after October 7th, but he planned on moving back. He wanted to move back to the U.S. When he was older, but never had the chance to. All right, so the next one here, Trump administration widens crackdown, revoking hundreds of student visas. So this is an article from Mondo Weiss, kind of a summary of some of this crackdown on the pro-Palestine speech in the U.S. And the big thing that I took out of this was recently, it was a couple weeks ago now at this point, Marco Rubio said that they revoked at least 300 visas as part of this crackdown. And they quote a lawyer here who, based on all of the different universities and their numbers of students that they've said lost visas, is that it seems like it's more like 1,000 visas have been revoked as part of this crackdown. And again, this is all, Amy Hutchinson, an attorney representing students at Arizona State University, said that at least 50 students had their visas revoked at the school. So 50 at one school. She also estimated that roughly 1,000 students had been revoked, much higher than Rubio's assertion. He said 300. And again, it's just such a large number from one school. So, and again, this all started, this is about cracking down on speech that's critical of Israel, of what Israel is doing in Gaza, just completely flouting the First Amendment. All right, so the next one here, Trump mulls drone strikes on Mexican cartels. So NBC News reported on Tuesday that the Trump administration is considering launching drone strikes against cartels in Mexico in an effort to stem the flow of fentanyl and other drugs through the southern border. The report, which cited multiple former and current U.S. officials, said the discussions were still in the early stages, but the administration has taken steps toward taking military action against cartels, including designating them as terrorist organizations and stepping up CIA drone flights over Mexico. The report said the Trump administration would prefer to launch drone strikes against cartels in cooperation with the Mexican government, but is not ruling out launching unilateral military action, which would significantly rupture U.S.-Mexico relations. In response to this report, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected the idea of any unilateral U.S. action. She said, quote, "We reject any form of intervention or interference. That's been very clear. Mexico coordinates and collaborates, but does not subordinate itself. There is no interference, nor will there be. While the idea hasn't been formally proposed, we've made it clear that it wouldn't address the root cause of the issue. What truly works is ongoing attention to root causes, arrests driven by intelligence and investigation, coordination, and zero tolerance for impunity. We categorically reject any such actions, and we don't believe they will happen. There is a strong ongoing dialogue on security and many other matters," end quote. So she's saying that, drone strikes won't work. We have to address root causes. She has been very willing to cooperate with the Trump administration on tariffs. She says that the CIA drone flights are happening, with Mexico's permission. So the Wall Street Journal reported in February that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had threatened Mexican military officials that the U.S. could take unilateral military action in Mexico, saying that if Mexico didn't deal with the collusion between the government and the drug cartels. So while the Trump administration wants to reduce the flow of fentanyl, opponents of turning the drug war into a hot war have warned that it's unlikely to have that effect. I put a quote in from Daniel DePetris. He's a fellow at Defense Priorities, which is like a realist think tank. And he pointed out in a post on X that if the demand for fentanyl still exists in the U.S., then cartels or other criminal organizations would still be willing to manufacture the drug and smuggle it across the border. He said, quote, "If demand for the drug is still high, the cartels or independent criminal syndicates will have a financial incentive to continue manufacturing, even if it comes at the risk of death. There is a lot of money to be made," end quote. So again, the root cause here is the demand for fentanyl in the U.S. And fentanyl, it's so potent that you don't have to smuggle much in. They're very small packages that people bring in. And as far as I understand it, most of it's smuggled by U.S. citizens. So it's not a problem that you could bomb away. And of course, this also brings the risk of bringing war to U.S. territory, bringing a real war to U.S. territory. The cartels have people in the U.S. They have advanced weapons. There's even the possibility of them firing missiles across the border. It could really turn into something big. All right, so the next one here, Turkey-backed SNA reduces presence in Afrin. So this one is from Jason Ditz. There's been a lot of news surrounding Turkey and its allied militia, the self-described Syrian National Army, in Syria's Aleppo district since the regime change back in December. There's been a lot of fighting between the Kurds and the SNA, but now there's a new security deal in the works and hopes that Kurds of Afrin may be able to return, which is in northern Syria. And they've been displaced since 2018, since this group took over the city. And a Syrian Defense Ministry official reported on Tuesday that the SNA is substantially reducing its presence in Afrin. They remain at some checkpoints and military posts, but the HTS government is keen to integrate them into the army and post them in army posts elsewhere in the country. They say regular Israeli airstrikes against bases across the country have slowed that redeployment. Kurdish political groups like the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, which is basically the U.S.-backed Kurds who control that part of Syria, they're expressing hope that with the SNA presence in Afrin on the decline, massive numbers of internally displaced persons can see the light at the end of the tunnel and may begin to try to go home. And just looking at kind of the situation in northern Syria, we were covering a lot. Jason was covering a lot, the fighting between the SNA and the Kurds. But over the past few days, past couple weeks, it looks like there hasn't been that fighting happening. And this could be a result of the Kurds signing a deal with the HTS-led government in Syria to integrate with them. And some people are saying, that Turkey wouldn't be happy about that. But I think, I don't think Jelani's doing anything that Turkey doesn't want him to do. Turkey is very involved, very supportive of the regime change of HTS, which of course grew out of Al-Qaeda in Syria. It looks like there's a chance here for the tensions to ease between the Kurds and Turkey. And that's a good reason for the U.S. to get out, because the U.S. is still in eastern Syria. All right, the next one here, Ryan Routh sought rocket launcher from Ukraine. So this article is from Fox News. Kind of a crazy story here. So federal prosecutors revealed that Ryan Routh, the accused would-be assassin of President Trump, sought to obtain military-grade weapons, including a rocket launcher, from a Ukrainian contact as part of his alleged assassination plot. Routh told his associate to send me a RPG or a Stinger anti-aircraft missile, and I'll see what I could do. He said Trump is not good for Ukraine. The pair discussed Routh's purchase options, with Routh inquiring if his associate could ship it to him before explaining his intent for the military-grade weapons. He said, quote, "I need equipment so that Trump cannot get elected," end quote. Routh went on to say the weapons of war get lost all the time in the battlefield and nobody would notice if one went missing. Prosecutors say that Routh also floated the idea of obtaining a rocket or missile launcher, with the suspect sending his associate an image of President Trump's plane and writing that that this is Trump's plane that he gets on and off daily. Routh's defense also submitted court filings on Monday, including a 13-page motion alleging that law enforcement used impermissibly suggestive tactics when interviewing an eyewitness identified as TCM. They claim the witness felt pressured to identify Routh because of the intense atmosphere created by the presence of multiple law enforcement agencies. So that's getting more into the case here, but the fact that he was, he helped, or said he helped recruit for Ukraine's Foreign Legion. He made, I believe, several trips to Ukraine. He was very supportive of the Azov battalion. So the fact that he was asking a Ukrainian contact for these types of weapons, and that Ukrainian contact gave him options, goes to show that there certainly is a black market when it comes to these weapons that the U.S. has been sending Ukraine. All right, so the last story here, China slams Vance for Peasants slur amid tariff war. So The tariff war between the U.S. and China is really heating up, and now Trump has placed another 50% tariffs on all Chinese goods. So there's 104, as far as I understand, it's all Chinese goods, and it's 104% total tariff. I mean, if you're American, this is going to affect you. Prices are going to rise. We're going to feel this. This is kind of getting into the diplomatic spat. So China has strongly criticized U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance for characterizing the Chinese as peasants amid the escalating trade war, calling his remarks ignorant and disrespectful. So Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Zhan said, quote, China's position on China-U.S. economic and trade relations has been made very clear. It is surprising and pathetic to hear such ignorant and disrespectful words from this vice president. Lin was responding to a media query on comments made by Vance in an interview with Fox News last Thursday, a day after U.S. President Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on most trading partners, including an extra 34% on Chinese imports. Defending the levies, Vance said, quote, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity. That's not a recipe for lower prices, and that's not a recipe for good jobs in the United States of America, end quote. So, I mean, referring to the Chinese as peasants, this is like a Biden-level diplomatic, mistake here. But, I'm referring to Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator. I don't know too much about the Chinese, but I've been to China, and I know enough about them that respect goes a really long way with them. And if you're trying to negotiate things, you don't go around calling them peasants and dictators. So it's a pretty foolish thing for Vance to say. And that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from James Carden, The Unnecessary War. One from Mahmoud Khalil, A Letter to Colombia. That's a letter from Khalil as he's still detained by the U.S. government. One from David S. D. Amato, The All-Devouring Machine, Pentagon Malfeasance and Insatiable Empire. One from Ramsey Baroud, Israeli Civil War on the Horizon. And our spotlight from Jason Jones, Ukraine and Gaza Bring Shame to America. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. We got a lot of stuff over there. Good stuff. Check out lower parts of the page where we post all sorts of other stories from around the internet. Thanks again for everyone who chipped in with our fundraiser. I really appreciate it. Other ways you could help us out is by sharing this show, like, subscribe, comment, follow us on social media. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.